Pull up a chair and join us, SAT-7 UK, as we bring together voices from across the UK, the Middle East and North Africa for honest, hopeful and thought-provoking conversation. No headlines, no soundbites, just real people, real stories and bold ideas that just might challenge the way we see the world. So, grab your headphones, settle in, it's time to join us around the table.
Hello, welcome to our very first live episode of Around the Table. I'm so excited that we are here today. Joining me is my co-host Mary, and we're going to dive into some of the amazing guests that we've got in a minute, but I just want to say what a privilege it is to be here having this first live episode. Today we're going to be exploring the theme of women in leadership, both in the UK and in the MENA, and what it means to lead with courage, with faith, and hope in what is, I think we can all agree, is a rapidly changing world. So to help us do that, we have three extraordinary women here today. I'm delighted to welcome, all the way from Cyprus, international CEO of SAT-7, Rita El-Mounayer. So Rita has been part of the SAT-7 story from the very beginning, joining the ministry in 1996 and helping to shape its vision and its growth over the last 3 decades. She began as a presenter, becoming a familiar face to many throughout the region with the much-loved story, Bedtime Stories with Rita. I love that one so much. And then before increasingly kind of taking on more senior leadership roles, overseeing programming, communications, strategy across SAT-7's Arabic, Persian and Turkish channels. And then in 2019, she was appointed international CEO, becoming the first woman to lead the ministry. And born and raised in Lebanon during the Civil War, Rita's experience has profoundly shaped both her faith and her passion for Christian media, and today is an internationally respected Christian media leader and the only woman to lead a satellite television broadcaster serving the Middle East and North Africa. So she brings a really unique perspective on leadership, faith, and the role of Christian media in some of the world's most complex contexts. So we are really delighted to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Rita.
And we are also joined by Julia Bicknell, who is an award-winning former BBC journalist, media leader, and currently the only female trustee on the board of SAT-7 UK. She brings more than 40 years' experience in broadcast and digital journalism, and she has led editorial teams, launched innovative media projects, and reported on stories both nationally and internationally. She has a particular passion within her role of media for international development, human rights, and freedom of religion or belief. Alongside her role as a trustee, she is a qualified coach and lay chaplain and has a heart for encouraging others and supporting asylum seekers and refugees. Welcome to the podcast, Julia.
Thank you very much.
And we have Rachel Fadipe. She is the CEO of SAT-7 UK, part of SAT-7's international Christian media work. She brings more than 20 years of experience in faith-based and cross-cultural leadership, with a background in senior roles within UK and international charities. She has a passion about developing people, strengthening organisational culture, and creating environments where teams can thrive. In her role at SAT-7, she consistently uses the organisation's vision and strategy to support mission and its media use to bring hope, encouragement, and transformation across the region. Thank you for joining us today, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Wow. Do you recognise yourselves, ladies?
Well, hopefully you can understand why I'm so excited to have these three incredible women around the table today. And we're looking forward to hearing more about your remarkable journeys and your kind of reflections on some of the interesting and meaty topics that we're going to dive into today. But before we dive in, we always like to start with a kind of fun, light-hearted question to kick us off for the conversation and help us get to know our guests a little bit better. So since we've got three incredibly well-travelled women around the table with us today, I thought we'd go for a sort of travel-themed question. So is there one city that you visited that you particularly loved or that you'd really love to go back to one day? I tell you what, Rita, since you've come the furthest, I think we're going to start with you.
I lived a couple of years in Oxford, and I loved that city or that town. I don't know if you call it city or town. I just loved it. I had the best years of my life studying in Oxford. And this culture of pubs, public houses, was like really new to me coming from Lebanon. But I really, really enjoyed, going to the pubs.
Well, I don't want to butter Rita up, but I have to say it would be Lebanon, would be my favourite place, yeah, and Beirut, where I've been many times. And it's not just because of the food, but that's a large part.
Wow, there's so many, but I think one that I never tire of, I think I've been there 4 times now, is Jerusalem. I just love the layers of history, the poking down the little alleys, and just being aware that, I walk the streets that maybe Jesus walked. And the last time I was there was actually kind of during COVID. And I thought to myself, my husband and I had to take some holiday because he was going to lose that holiday. And I thought, where in the world should we go where the crowds will not be there? And I thought, Israel. And you know what? We walked into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and where the previous time you couldn't even get in the church, it was pretty empty. And we wandered all round, and we went right down into the basement. And I just had it was almost spine-tinglingly amazing, because there was just not many people around. And so for me, yeah, I think Jerusalem.
So you can see the difference, the spiritual Jerusalem and the pubs.
What about you, Mary?
I'd have to say there's a small town in Nairobi in Kenya, a place that I travelled like 10 years ago now, which I just felt like it was just such a beautiful experience for me. There were so many elements of being in that city that I enjoyed. The people, the food, was eating a lot of roti, chapatis and foods like that. So I think for me it would be the town in Kenya, in Nairobi.
Nice. I love that. We've got such a spread. Mine is far more domestic. I was going to say in Sicily, a city called Catania, which is... the people were so friendly and very relaxed. It's quite a gritty city in some ways, but the food was incredible, and just so much food all the time, and so cheap as well. There you got me a food, basically. So thinking about our topic while we're actually here today, we're thinking about women in leadership, about the region, specifically also about the UK. I think the kind of broad question that's on my mind when we start thinking about this is, what does it actually mean to be a woman in leadership? That has so many repercussions in terms of women's perceptions of leadership, perceptions of women in leadership, and how we can kind of dive down and dig into that topic a bit more. So I wonder if, Rita, we could ask you if leadership is something that you always aspired to, or was it perhaps something that kind of came a little bit more naturally, kind of later down the line?
I was born in Beirut during the war in Lebanon, and I had a tough childhood because my dad was part of the Christian militia, the Phalanges in Lebanon. We were not very rich, we were poor. I remember I got to school with a hole in my shoe. But my dad played a big role in my life. He insisted that girls should be educated in private schools. And now I communicate with you in my 3rd language. I speak 3 languages fluently, and it's because of my dad. But I never, ever imagined one day that I will become a leader or a CEO. I didn't aspire it, to be honest. And when I joined SAT-7, all I thought about is to make a difference in people's lives, especially children. And I was never ambitious to be a CEO. Maybe because I thought I'm just a girl from Lebanon. I'm from Baalbek, Bekaa Valley. I don't have a lot of money. I'm nobody, actually. But this is where you see the hand of God in all this. Because SAT-7 for me, from the beginning, was not a job. It was a call. God called me when I was not ready, when I didn't have big ambitions, when I didn't aspire to be more and be leader. And so really, leadership for me is about a call in your life. You can be a leader CEO, and you can be a leader presenting on the screen or producing on the screen and becoming a role model for many people in the Middle East. And now if I want to choose, if you tell me choose, I will go back and be presenter and producer on the screen because it's lovely just to see and witness what your programs and what you did on the screen made the effect, what you did on people's lives.
Thank you, Rita. I feel like what you said there really brings it down to some of the heart of leadership, that it's about, or particularly in this kind of sector for those around the table, how God is using you rather than your own kind of personal ambitions. For many people, of course, that's not the case, but really, really heartfelt. Thank you, Rita. Rachel, I wonder if I could ask you, because you have quite an interesting background as well. You started in engineering, is that right?
Yes. I mean, your question about aspiring to leadership, I don't know if anybody aspires to leadership. I think you find yourself in a role, and leadership is perhaps one of the things that you need. But yeah, my route was definitely not obvious or planned, but I trained as an electronic engineer and worked for a large, big corporate car company for many, many years, and I was the queen of speedometers for a fair few years, which is not a thing that most people can say. But I do think, God brought me to SAT-7 for sure. It wasn't anything that I looked out for. And I have found myself in this leadership role. And I think my time in the big corporate world probably taught me more of what not to do than what to do. But I think that's still incredibly helpful, because what bad leadership can sometimes look like. Not that it was all bad, and I think that really helps you shape who you want to be and the sort of organisation you want to be a part of. And I'm sure we'll unpack that more, but I think, the culture of an organisation is really key and bigger than any one leader. I don't know what you think, Julia.
Shall I tell a little bit about my background? So I grew up in quite a conservative part of the church here in the UK, and I hope you don't mind if I use the shorthand phrase. I was kind of given the message, sit down, shut up, and put your hat on. And I used to go to church as a little girl with a bonnet, and I never thought that like you said, I'm this little girl, as it were. And then my family moved, and when I was about 12, I went to a class, a sort of Sunday school class, and I was put in for the public reading of scripture competition, and I won it. And it was the first time that I thought, hey, I can do something. I can stand in public, I can read the Bible, and I can win an award for it. And I'd still tell you the chapter. It was Romans chapter 5. And that was 60 years ago, probably almost 60 years ago. And I suppose from that moment, I kind of realized that actually God had made me the way he'd made me. He'd given me the gifts that he had given me, and he meant me to use them. The problem was I then had to struggle to work out what, if I was growing up and I was a Christian, how did I do that, given the background that I came from? And I think I have to say it was quite a difficult teenage years, because I felt that I wanted to basically go into broadcasting. I wanted to become a journalist, but I'm talking the 1970s, and the message very much in the church at that time was, don't send your daughter into the BBC, for instance, because it's all sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and she will lose her faith. And that was very much the message that I got. And yet I felt really clearly that I felt God had given me this real curiosity. I was always asking questions. I was always trying to understand the world. And I felt increasingly that I was meant to become a journalist. And in those days, it wasn't like there is now. You can't have your own podcast. You can't have your own, influencer YouTube channel. If you wanted to join the media, it was the traditional media. And there were basically three outlets, the BBC, ITV. It was even before Channel 4 existed. So God clearly opened the doors for me. And I got into the BBC as a graduate. But interestingly, while I was working there, the first work I had there was during my summer holiday as a student. And it was fascinating because I went in as a sort of clerk, secretary, and I was just seen like that. I was the young woman who did the typing. And it was very, very different for some of the men who were around me. So it's a very different world. I mean, I'm talking almost 50 years ago now. So a lot has changed. But in those days, it was very much women are secretaries and typists. They're not, I had an idea I'd love to be a foreign correspondent. There were no women foreign correspondents when I joined the BBC. And in fact, the first woman was a woman called Diana Goodman, who was the correspondent from Bonn. And I think she got that job in about 1986. And I'd already been in the BBC some years before that happened. So the classic thing, you can't be what you can't see. I couldn't see that you could be a woman working as a foreign correspondent.
It's very interesting what you're saying, Julia, because I thought that this only happens in the Middle East, not in a place like England and the UK. Because my experience is so different. As Lebanese, living in Lebanon, you can see women leaders, women in positions. My dad really insisted that we get good education. He always says, when I started with SAT-7, she represents nations and people of the world. And we didn't have this problem at all. And of course, there are many countries in the Middle East that are different than Lebanon. But in Lebanon, you can see women leaders at churches, pastors, CEOs. So I'm not unique in that context. But really interesting to hear that the UK was like this,
I'm a little bit older than you, so I'm talking a few years before your time. But it was true, and when I look at pictures of my contemporaries in the BBC, it's really, really noticeable that it's absolutely predominantly men in the photos, all the photos. Now, there were women around, but they, and if you had a job in the BBC and you were married, you had to leave that job if you married and that kind of thing. So it was quite difficult to, if you were married to, I need to clarify, anyone in the BBC, you had to resign.
So the woman leaves, not the man.
Yes.
It's really interesting. Thank you for kind of picking this out, because it's something that we wanted to dive into a little bit more later down in the conversation. But the reality is that there are challenges and obstacles that women face, all the way across the world. And of course, women's experiences in different contexts are different, and they can vary vastly. But the reality is that these challenges that women face to some extent, particularly thinking about women in leadership roles, and how the kind of public perception of that has shifted or not, as the case may be. Many of those challenges, they're continuous throughout contexts. And so it's really important for us to kind of, highlight those and draw them out. I wonder, your experience, Rachel, does that kind of echo some of these or not so much?
I think every sector in every country is probably different. I came into engineering as, I think I was the only lady on my degree course, so then went into a thing where they had, I forget how many, but a lot of graduates, and there was 5-10% of women. But there were women, and there were women in the workplace before I got there, and it's only grown more since. So I think it's great that we're able to take on these new roles. And I think I've never been one that feels that you need to change the nature of the role of women or where women are by positive discrimination. I think we need to show that we're capable and and do a great job. I think we can encourage, putting my engineering hat on, I think we can encourage children to do sciences, and that's how we can change things. But I think it's really important that we do a good job, and the fact that we're a woman becomes almost great but secondary, I think. And we have a wonderful model, don't we, as Christians? You know, we've got the Bible that shows us how to model leadership, and we've got Jesus' example. So I think we have an even better opportunity in Christian organisations to really model great Christian leadership. I mean, my little story about being a woman in an engineering environment was I was sitting at work one day, and the chap I was sitting next to me was coming up to retirement, and he's Tony, his name. He said, "Rachel, you do know you're sitting in a man's desk." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, a few years ago, a man was sitting there and, you know, providing for his family, and now you are. So some man is out there not providing for his family." Of course, ridiculous. So I said, well, maybe there's a man out there doing the job of his dreams, you know, that wouldn't be a job of my dreams, and we're all happy. But, you know, it does take time to change certain views, and I think the engineering sector is very different now, and I suspect the media sector is as well. And it's great to see that. And I know some parts of the Middle East are very different, and some parts, you know, women are it's very, very hard for them. But I think the Christian area is an area actually where there's probably more roles for women.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because lots of people would say that women have unique perspectives and strengths that maybe aren't necessarily reflected in other areas. And it's really important that women have the opportunity to bring those to the table. And, you know, for some people, it's about kind of filling the roles that have been, you know, the shoes that have gone before, shall I say. And for other people, it's actually really important that women can inhabit those spaces in a way that feels natural to them, rather than feeling like they have to exhibit certain characteristics. They can just show up to those roles, you know, as themselves with all their kind of natural God-given gifts. Is that something that you feel the three of you have had the opportunity to do? Or it sounds like maybe there have been certain circumstances where actually that's not been so easy to obtain, that kind of natural, relaxed femininity, if you will. Julia, I know you had a very... Yeah.
Well, I was thinking, as you were saying that, sort of through the era that I was working, there was very much, we remember Mrs. Thatcher became the first woman Prime Minister, and that was the year that I joined the BBC. And there was this sense, and with Mrs. Thatcher, I think it was true, that, you know, you had to sort of be like a man. You know, you had to act like a man. You had to, be in your mannerisms and the way that you are. And there was this whole era of, you know, women used to wear suits. You know, in fact, I just gave one to the charity shop last week. I thought, I'm never going to wear that suit. And it was very much, you know, we imitated how we dressed because we wanted to be taken seriously. So we'd wear navy suits, to look sharp and look sort of official at news meetings and things like that. The story I wanted to tell you was when I'd been producing Woman's Hour for 6 months or so, and I had my annual appraisal in the BBC, and this was now sort of towards the end of the 80s, so still a very long time ago. But the feedback that I got at that time was, your problem, Julia, is you smile too much and you're not ruthless enough. And I kind of took that to heart, and I was quite ambitious at that time. And I was on this great program that everybody loved, and people would, you know, the men I used to meet would always tell me they listened. They didn't let their wives know that they would secretly listen. And I went away and I sort of tried to take that feedback to heart. And I used to smile at people in the lifts all the time. And I stopped sort of smiling because I thought that, you know, I'd been given this feedback. And then I found myself getting a bit miserable because I realised that I wasn't sort of, you know, radiating, I would say, the joy of the Lord. And this whole thing about being ruthless, I realised that being a Christian meant that I wasn't ruthless, because the definition of ruthless is without sympathy, that you are ruthless. You don't have that in your kind of makeup and your decision making. And the verse came back to me very strongly. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? And I realized that I was potentially in danger of, losing my soul, because I was trying to be this person that innately, as a Christian, filled with, the Holy Spirit and the joy of the Lord, I wasn't. And I just realized that I just had to be myself. And if that meant I was never going to become the BBC Director General, that was okay. And in fact, there's one friend I've got who still tells me regularly, you should have been the Director General. And I don't believe him or agree with him, but, it's nice that he thought that I could have done that. But I didn't have that ruthless ambition that I was prepared to, tread on other people, step on. And there are, I won't go into incidences, but I could see this happening around me. And I just didn't want to be one of those people. So,
Rita, I was thinking about, we've kind of segued nicely into the topic of the media, and obviously SAT-7 is all about, a digital Christian media ministry. And, the reality is that the media has an enormous influence over how we see the world, the perceptions of women, the perceptions of women in leadership specifically, thinking more broadly in terms of the media, as well as SAT-7. But, do you feel it's important that SAT-7 represents women, that we see women as leaders and as change makers, and that maybe SAT-7 has the question is, does SAT-7 have a responsibility to kind of represent women in a way that we feel is biblical and represents their value? Is that something that, you kind of think about?
Yeah, sure. A lot of young ladies in SAT-7 and outside, when I became a CEO, they came to me and they said that SAT-7 is walks the talk, because we, for many years, produced programs that empower the role of women in culture and society. And SAT-7 has chosen a woman to be the first CEO taking over from the founder. But of course, there are a lot of challenges. And I would like to comment on what Julia said a little bit. What was the first advice that a board member gave me the time I became a CEO? The first advice was, don't dress like that. And I took it seriously, and I bought a ticket to come to London and to change my wardrobe. And the majority of the clothes that I have purchased were suits. And then I see pictures of me the first year wearing suits. I looked awful. It's not me. And then I've decided, what is wrong if being me, what is wrong, not being me? Dressing modestly, but with dresses. One person told me, don't use red color. And now I'm using, even my shoes are red. So this is the challenge sometimes that you face as a woman leader. One person said, oh, you're a bit emotional. Now I'm older. I'm talking about not being a CEO when I became executive director of the Arabic channels. Oh, Rita, you're a little bit emotional. I was in my 30s, now I'm in my 50s. And I'm asking myself, what is wrong being emotional, being a human? You'll give the opportunity for other people to feel that you don't need to be perfect, woman or man, to be in a position, in a leadership position. But now, again, back to your question, it's really a blessing, especially when I see young girls now within the ministry, within SAT-7, are inspired that one day they will have a leadership role in a ministry like SAT-7. And I'm keeping an eye on some young girls within SAT-7 that they have great potential to be great CEOs.
I really love what you just said, Rita. I think one of the things that I think all three of you have touched upon is actually the visibility and being able to see women. If you're in, environments where you don't see women, you don't know what to model. And so I think it's important to note that, you're using even fashion and the ability to be expressive and to show authenticity. Those are things that actually, for me, are the makeup of leaders, being, bold enough to own it. And what it does is it helps, viewers or people that you work with, it helps there to be a resonance because they can understand that, like you said, you're a human being. So we're talking about media and storytelling, but being yourself, being authentic is actually storytelling in and of itself as leadership. So I think that's really good.
That's something true. I was scared when I became a CEO that people will compare me with the founder, Terry Ascott. I was really scared because Terry is brilliant and he's a founder and he's very intelligent. I'm not like this. I have my own strength, but also I have many weaknesses. And one person in particular from the board, I shared this with him. I told him, I am just scared that people will always compare me with Terry. And then he said, they will never stop comparing you with Terry. And it's not a problem. The problem is if you compare yourself with Terry all the time. And that was the greatest advice ever. I am different. I am a woman. I have emotions. I don't know a lot of finance, but that's why I have a finance person together with me to help me. And it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to show your weaknesses. As long as you have a team next to you and knowing inside of your heart that this is a ministry and God doesn't use only the perfect. He uses people who are broken, who have lots of weaknesses like myself. Sorry, Julia.
But I think, again, Mary used the word authenticity, and I think this has been a real change over the last 10, 20 years when we say, authenticity, integrity, being yourself is good. But I'm thinking back through my career, women could not be authentic to themselves because I'm thinking of all the women I worked with and the leaders. They couldn't really even talk about their children because having children at home was a difficulty because it got in the way of your working hours. And so, constantly there were things like, important meetings would happen after the end of the day's work in the pub. When the men would be perfectly free to go and have a drink before they go home. The women would probably be rushing home to cook for the kids and cook for the husband and da-da-da. And so I think we forget how much the working environment has changed over the last, 20, 30 years. Because now, not only women, but men will have their photos of their children on their work desk. But I remember women wouldn't dare to say, can I come in late because I want to go to the school, carol concert, or can I take my child to the hospital? It was almost like you didn't talk, your family wasn't meant to exist.
Is it different now?
It's very different now. And the whole thing with COVID and working from home. But because the woman still predominantly takes the caring responsibilities, it was like men didn't really think about working life needing to adapt and change to allow women the flexibility of looking after the family. She had to be at the morning meeting at 8:30, 9 o'clock without fail every morning. She couldn't say, well, can I take my kids to school and drop them off? And so we had, nurseries and nannies and whatever. That was the only way you could really be a working mother when I was coming up through the ranks, was if you had the money to afford a nanny, or you could pay for your child to be at a nursery from 7:30 in the morning and maybe till you picked them up. I'm talking about someone working as I did in central London, where you could, you had a long journey. But I'm just saying the world of work has really changed a lot as well. And that's helped women, because as more women got into those leadership positions, they're able to say, well, hang on a minute, how about, it's okay to take half a day to take your child to the hospital. But if those women were not in the positions where they could bring that change, it wasn't happening.
And I think these days we've created organisations where the culture is much more embracing and encouraging of people of, we've got in SAT-7 UK both men and women who want to work part-time, who want to be home for the kids. And so I think there's much greater flexibility. I think this current generation, I'm looking at Mary and Sophie because you're younger than us, but you guys have got it, you've got your priorities, I think, straighter than perhaps we did, or you've got that opportunity. And I think it's great to see the change. It's brilliant to see that, women can come back to work, can engage, can have fulfilling roles, and have families as well. So I do think things have changed, and that's for the better.
Yeah, thank you. You've pulled out some really important topics there. And I think it's amazing to see how far maybe we've come in certain areas. But of course, there are, many women's experience still, maybe not to that extent, but still kind of reflects some of those challenges, some of those obstacles. And you mentioned, Julia, about the pandemic, and that was probably a real opportunity to kind of shine a bit of a mirror on some of these things where, lots of this kind of just domestic labour, what we call the emotional load, that fell predominantly to women, and still does, in many ways. And thinking about how we can adjust if appropriate, or how we can, kind of adapt to these different things and allow women the opportunity to take on those leadership roles. And we often talk about SAT-7 about telling a different story, don't we? And I wonder if, that story of, for example, you in this incredible leadership role, Rita, that in and of itself is SAT-7 telling a different story, and it's mirrored by you, Rachel, here in the UK, telling that different story. And the important, please do.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think SAT-7 has this amazing opportunity to show what women are doing in the Middle East. I mean, what many of us here in the West perhaps think of what life is like in the Middle East for women will be very different country to country. And what an amazing opportunity to get an Egyptian judge onto a programme in Arabic telling people how she got to this role. And then women at home in Sudan, in Egypt, and right across the region can watch that programme and can go, wow, maybe I too can aspire to that. And then to showcase examples of, someone who started a sewing group for refugee women and now has 100 refugee women able to provide for their families through this thing. And that's where, we can give that voice to the people in the region. And I think that's such a powerful opportunity. We're talking about leadership, but leadership is about influence. It's not necessarily about having a job title. It's about being, doing what you do and helping others and supporting others. And I often think the best leaders don't have a job title that implies a leadership role. They are leading from within and they are influencing and people trust them. And it's so powerful to see. And I love that we can showcase that on SAT-7.
We have many programs that tell the stories of women in the Middle East. And some of them stories of success. But some of them also challenging stories of how a woman should dress before she goes and take a bus or use the public transport, or how a woman cannot make a decision and the agony of not making a decision, but her brother should make the decision or on her behalf, or her father or her husband. So we produce these programs and put them on the screen, and the feedback is really great. But it's sometimes it's a vicious cycle, because from my experience, a lot of times the biggest hindrance of women's, let's say, freedom is women themselves. I remember when I became a CEO, and until today, our International Council and Executive Board, they consist of many church leaders. Some of them are bishops. When they introduce me to people, they say, this is our boss. Just imagine that. But again, you see that a lot of women, and in my case, the women, the people that were not very happy with me being a CEO, there were 2 women. They gave me the feedback like, why you, in a way? And one of them resigned, actually, when I was elected the CEO. So women should also play a role in changing women's attitudes. It's not just the man. The mother just educate her daughter, or don't do this, or shame on you, or how to sit, or what to eat, and not laugh loud, and what to wear. And this is the women. And we need really to educate our women how to empower their daughters, their children, other friends, women friends, and leaders.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rita. You make a really good point about the kind of internalized patriarchy, and often those pieces of advice which we might kind of cringe at, they're offered as almost self-preservation strategies, aren't they? For kind of as we navigate this world, which is obviously not a matriarchy or anything similar. And so a lot of the times women might think that they're helping to give, good advice to their loved ones and things. And yet actually what they're perhaps doing is kind of passing on some of those things you mentioned around shame and
they say, we were raised like this. This is our culture. You cannot change, like things. So you need to just do it like I've done it. So this should change as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as Christians having this conversation, we have a fresh lens over some of these things, don't we? Because, God made men and women, and he loves men and women, and he loves them equally. And, many men and women have different strengths, but maybe many women and women have different strengths, right? And it's really important that we're able to approach this conversation with that lens and that love of Christ. And that's something that I think perhaps is often missing from the wider conversation, and is something that we don't necessarily have the opportunity to think about, that everyone there around that table or in that boardroom or whatever it might be, everyone there is so loved by Christ. And, he died for every single one of them. And that changes how we approach some of these things and have these conversations. And I think that's what makes, this conversation from a faith perspective really different. And we have something as Christians different to add to that conversation. And I wonder, something that really kind of struck me when you were talking earlier, Rita, was, has there ever been a moment for you, kind of in your leadership roles or what have you, where you realised that your presence as a leader mattered, not because you wanted to make a statement or it was your job title, as Rachel mentioned, but because somebody else needed to see it, and God was using you in that way?
Yes, many times. And sometimes I tend to leave my opinion or decision to the end because I don't want to influence what other people are thinking around the table. Some people, maybe because it's a position, they feel that they have to follow. Maybe you know that. And even though they don't agree. And I don't want that. I would like to be challenged. I would like, to hear the honest opinion of people around me. And that's why I tend a lot of times to speak last or to make a decision after everybody gave their opinion, because I can shift how the conversation goes and make a huge influence on decisions. I realize also when I come to the office and I'm not smiling, people feel agitated around me. I'm like, is she okay? Is she upset with me? Why Rita is not happy? And I'm just having an ordinary day. Maybe, I should be smiling all the time. So yes, you influence everybody around you without you knowing. A lot of times I say, oh yeah, I would love, a Starbucks or Costa coffee, and then suddenly I have a Starbucks or coffee, So I tend to be very careful, like what to say and how to say it, because I really would love a shared leadership. It's not about you on top and everybody do what you want them to do. You want a conversation, you want a shared responsibility.
I actually think that's why women make great leaders. There is actually some research that says women are naturally more collaborative and transformational in their style, and they build on others rather than, being autocratic and having their word. It's just, that's what the research says. It bears out in my experience. I think it is easier for women. We don't want to take the credit for other people's work. We want to hear, we want to get that input. And I think that's what makes actually organisations that are led by women often better places to work, in my humble opinion.
I agree with you. And I read once that a great king, or a queen, but let's say king, a great king is a king who doesn't want to be a king. And I think this is the essence of leadership, where you know that your leadership is shared with people around you. You cannot do it alone. And I really didn't want to be on top of the pyramid. I just wanted to make a difference. And this is why SAT-7 is a call. This is why we do what we do.
And that's why I think it makes a difference. A job is one thing, a calling is something different. And I think that probably impacts our leadership. Probably didn't help you in the BBC, Julia. But
Yeah, we're sorry for that.
No, well, I totally felt God. There's no way I would have got into the BBC as I did without God opening the doors in an amazing way. And I absolutely acknowledge that. And at the same time, I also felt God made it really clear when he wanted me to take one or two different moves. And one of them involved, long story short, taking a year's career break from the BBC to launch Premier Radio in 1995. And he made that so clear. As you were talking, I was just thinking, I think one of the hardest things of being a leader is this thing of you always having to be one step ahead of the team. Sometimes you're feeling, I wish I wasn't the leader because, I don't quite know what's going to happen next. Or, we had some, in the first year at Premier Radio, I know this is a very long time ago, 30 plus years, we did have some really serious financial problems, and it was probably one of the toughest few months of my life. And yet I knew that God had called me to go and do that. And after that, I went back to the BBC. And so, I think, just this thing of having to be one step ahead, even though you don't necessarily know what's happening, because you have the sort of the loneliness of the leader is one thing I would say. And I think the other thing, and I've heard politicians say this, we look at other people and we think, they have the power, they can make decisions, they can, decide the fate of nations or whatever. And then you get into I'm not saying I've been at that level, but when you are in those positions where difficult decisions have to be taken, maybe in Premier we had to make people redundant. And that wasn't something I'd ever anticipated myself having to do. Was, Lord, I thought you brought me into this to, grow it and thrive and develop, not sort of tell people they didn't have a job the next month. So because God calls you in there, he doesn't necessarily make it really easy for you. It can be very challenging and very tough. But that's, I think, some of the things that you're called. And when you're called, even if it's not easy, you're meant to be there.
May I add one thing? I think in my experience, the trap that I fell into is always trying to prove myself that I am good as a CEO, as a female CEO. In other words, I wanted to have answers to all the questions. I wanted to have solutions to every problem that comes and be put on my table. I wanted to not to ask for help. I want to do it alone. And COVID actually helped me because 2019 I became a CEO, then COVID hit. So I had like a 1 year of reflections, walking on the beach, praying, and trying to find myself as a leader. And this helped me a lot. So today, if you ask me something and I don't know, I'll tell you, I'm sorry, I don't know. And I don't feel ashamed to cry for help. Say, hey, help, no, I cannot cope with this. I don't have a solution for the matter. What do you think the solution should be? And the trap is when we try hard. Because we're female, we want to prove ourselves, and then we burn ourselves out.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful piece that you've shared there. I think with women, one of the questions that I'm thinking with about your journeys and the reflections that you're currently making is, what part of leadership has actually surprised you about yourself? Because you've just shared a big difference between 2019 and then when COVID hit, and you realize that there's some adjustments that you need to make, and now you're bold to come out in that confidence of, I can be vulnerable and I can ask for help, I need support. What are the moments, or what are the things that have happened in your journeys that you've realized has actually surprised you about yourself? Because I think you've all said, one thing that you've all said is that you've had moments where you're like, I don't really want to do this, I don't want to be the person that has to answer the question. So where have those things happened in your journey?
I think there's probably a lot to say in that. I do think leadership changes as the organisation changes. So I think you can often find that you need to become a different person, behave in a different way. As if when you're small, you do it one way, and when you're bigger, it's much more about bringing other people along with you and empowering other people. And I think that quite surprised me, really, to realise that the same job can feel completely different. Isn't it lovely doing this live in a place where the bells suddenly ring and echo? But I think I'm being intentional, perhaps, is another thing that surprised me. I think you have to be intentional about your style, be intentional about where the organisation is going, be intentional about the sort of values and behaviours you want the organisation to go. I never thought those were things I'd have to think about. I just thought it was, I started off making speedometers. I mean, that was a very tangible output, isn't it? And actually, when you're in a leadership position, there often isn't a tangible output in the same way. I don't know what you think, Julia.
I was, as you were talking, I was just thinking, in answer to Mary's question, I think the thing I learned over the years was to trust my instincts and my hunches, and whether you would call them sort of God-inspired or God-given, but I think I learned to have confidence that if I thought, particularly someone I met had potential, and maybe I was taking a real risk by hiring an unknown person. On the whole, as I kind of learned, and obviously I didn't know it all immediately, but I realised that generally my hunches were right about people. And some of the people I've hired over the years, just a quick example from Premier, as I mentioned, Premier Radio, we hired a young woman who had just graduated 30 years ago. She's called Charmaine. She's now the managing director of Premier. She's stayed in Premier 30 years, and she is now one of the most senior people there. And I just saw her as a 21-year-old graduate, and she came in, and so she was a good find. And sometimes you don't always get it right, but I'd love to think that Charmaine is one, but there are many others I could point to. And just say, you don't know, but you just think, this person seems to have potential, let's see. And I'm sure you've had that with people you've hired over the years, and whether that's worked out. So I think that for me is one thing I've learned.
Have you learned anything, Rita, being the leader?
I was really surprised with the respect I got from men in the Middle East, and in particular church leaders. people like bishops and wearing the hats and everything else. I never thought that I'll gain their respect, and they want to know what I think and my opinion and how they introduce me to people. So this is really priceless when you get the respect of the big shots, men who are older and in big positions. And I really thank God for that. It's not easy knowing the Middle East. And of course, what I shared with you regarding leadership, it's my perspective, it's my story as a Lebanese woman with the education that my dad had provided. But it's not a normal story. You hear lots of stories of struggling women in the Middle East who didn't have this privilege to be educated. Maybe they're smarter than me, maybe they're better than me, but they didn't have, like what I had. And you hear lots of stories in the Middle East, Yemenis, girls, Iranians, like women in Egypt, in rural areas that didn't get what I got. And these are the type of women that we're trying all the time to reach, with stories of success from other women who live the same circumstances, but they made it in life.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. I think all three of you have made some really lovely points this afternoon about leadership being about being humble and authentic and recognizing and being kind of open about weaknesses, and that's actually a strength rather than a weakness. And I think maybe this kind of taps into that idea of how we can be better, maybe organizationally, maybe culturally, maybe as Christians, at kind of recognizing people's God-given gifts and, bringing them in and kind of encouraging them and supporting them that way, as opposed to thinking about, okay, how can we fill this position, or, this role needs to be done. And I wonder, as churches, as communities, as organizations, how you feel we can kind of encourage and equip women to be the leaders of tomorrow, but also just to be, kind of comfortable and confident in themselves and their roles, and the fact that they do indeed have those God-given gifts and talents, and how we can kind of nourish and to some extent cherish, women who are, like you mentioned, Julia, coming up as, young graduates, and how we can give them those opportunities. I wonder if Rachel, as someone who's currently hiring at the moment, if maybe you have any thoughts.
Delegate. No, sorry. I think it's really good to recognise talent in everybody that we hire, men and women, and to help them to deliver their potential. That's what I would seek to do. I do think sometimes women need more encouragement because not all women, obviously, but quite a few have a kind of an imposter syndrome, or will naturally perhaps put themselves down. And I think often I find just encouraging women and ladies in the office just to trust their instincts, as you say, Julia, because I think that's so important. To trust your judgment on things, and that's fed by experience. So I think, hiring people is one of the hardest jobs I think we have, and seeing that potential in someone and seeing their ability to fit into a team and creating that team culture, I think is so difficult, and so it's not an enviable thing to have to do. Did you want to?
Well, I was going to say, I think I don't know whether it's changed. I'd be interested to hear what maybe Rita and Mary might even have to answer on this one. But when I was applying way back when for the BBC, I wanted to apply for a job, and it said, to apply for this, you must have worked on a local newspaper. Now, at the time, I had not worked on a local newspaper, but I had worked on the local BBC radio station. But I didn't apply because it said local paper. When I turned up for interviews for something slightly different, I realised that all these men had applied, even though they hadn't worked on local papers either. And what it brought home to me is women, and they've now got the research, but they didn't think about it in those days. Women tend to look at the criteria and think, oh, well, I don't have that, I can't have that. Whereas men will just say, oh, well, I haven't done that, but I'll apply anyway. I don't know whether it's changed because now we're aware of this, but I do think that is a concern, that Women tend to, slightly sort of do themselves down, underestimate what their experience really means. Whereas, as I said, I think men will just read the criteria and think, well, I'll have a shot, because what's the worst thing that can happen? I won't get the job. Whereas women will think, well, I haven't possibly got a chance of getting that job. So I do think that is a difference. I don't know whether you think it's people are more aware of that nowadays.
Yeah, well, you remember you said that when you were a kid, they will tell you to wear your hat and be quiet. What did you do? You just
I did,
you obeyed. Yeah,
for a long time.
I think women should push back. They should push back with respect, of course. I'll tell you a story, and it's a little bit a funny story, but it tells you about sometimes how women tend to wear the hat and be quiet. I was in Egypt, and I was invited, it happened to be in Egypt, and I was invited by a producer to come to the studio and be interviewed with another big shot of a big television network in Egypt. So it was the last minute thing. He said, Rita, I'm interviewing this man, and I would like you, because you're in Egypt, to be part of this interview. Would you mind? I said, no, but I have a flight to catch in the evening. He said, it's fine, but it will be brilliant that you and him to be interviewed by me. And I said, okay, great. So I went to the studio, and he was there, that big shot, sitting, on the set, and waiting for the director of the Arabic programs in SAT-7. I was not the CEO then. In his mind, it was a male. So I came and I said, hello. He said, hello. And I sat on the set in front of him. So he looked at me funnily, a little bit, just not sure why I sat there. And then he approached me and he said, is my makeup okay? So I looked at him and I said, yeah, I think it's okay. And then I told myself, okay, maybe he thinks I'm the makeup girl. So I should introduce myself formally. And I said, hi, I'm Rita El-Mounayer, and I will be with you, a guest, on this show. And he said, no, the guest on the show will be the director of the Arabic program channels in SAT-7. And I said, yes, me. And he said, no, this person, he lives in Cyprus, and he has a flight, in the evening to catch. And I said, yes, me. He was shocked. And you can tell the whole episode we're filming, the tension. Like each time I'm saying something, I have a different opinion, he will push back hard. And this is where I put the hat of a Lebanese fighter, and I really pushed back more and more. And it was really not great episodes because you can see that we were pushing back and forth. But I have decided that I will not be intimidated. And I think sometimes, with respect, the women at church, at work, in ministries, should push back. Our thought sometimes that we are quiet, wear our hat, I love that, wear our hat and be quiet. No, we shouldn't. We should push back a little bit with respect.
It makes for a funny anecdote, but it really cuts to the heart of some of these issues that we've been talking about today, doesn't it? And I wonder, as we kind of think about starting to wrap up our conversation, what if there's something, hopefully there's something that kind of encourages you when you're thinking about the future, what really gives you hope for the next generation of women leaders. I know, Julia, in particular, you've talked a lot about your experiences as you were coming up, and maybe they weren't always such positive experiences. But, is there something in particular perhaps that can give us hope for the future, or maybe that we should be thinking about embodying in our own communities, when we go home on Sunday or back into the office tomorrow, whatever it might be? Is there something that we can be doing, or is there something that, is really giving us hope for the future and for the leaders of tomorrow?
Well, so I always try as much as I can to encourage, mentor, connect people. I mean, just this week, just to give you a small example, a friend who I have, young woman I've coached, she told me about a woman in her church who has a particular qualification. Could I connect her with some people in the BBC, which I've done on an email? I don't know whether it will get anywhere, but I really try so hard to do that, because I know sometimes it just takes one connection, and then the person may not get a job or whatever, but at least you've helped them to kind of find their way. I think the other thing that encourages me is just that the world is so different now. That young women are. I know not everybody likes her, but one woman, I think, talking about this whole thing of authenticity and leadership, I thought Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, was amazing, because she was showing you that you could be a Prime Minister, you could have a baby while you're in office, and you could just talk as a human being. And I think you see those examples in the world, which I never saw apart from Maggie Thatcher when I was kind of growing up. Or was a young adult at that point. So I think that gives me hope that people like Rita are the international chief executive, or chief executive international, so that gives me encouragement. It is a different world, and I think it has changed for the better.
I mean, I would agree. I think it's encouraging to see how much has changed. Just chatting now, I think of the workplace today is very different to even when I started. And I think people have new opportunities, and they have opportunities to hear from people like us and hear our experience. And I think that all of that is really powerful, because the next generation doesn't need to make the same mistakes as us. They can make a whole new set. But I think it is great to see the future. It's great. We haven't talked much about what SAT-7 does, but I think it's fantastic that SAT-7, led by Rita, has this incredible platform to go into the homes of people across the Middle East, to model what Jesus taught us, and to show the true value that God has in women, and that value he places in women right at the beginning of the Bible. And I think, to both talk about that, to put the examples of what women have done in situations where perhaps they're in a very different culture to you were in Lebanon, where they can't own property, what do they do? And if their husband dies, they can't be the head of the household, the culture doesn't let them. But actually we can bring women in who have dealt with that and who can say what they did. And I just think that's an incredible opportunity that we have, and it's a real privilege to be a part of that. And we get messages from people every day in SAT-7 whose lives have been transformed, both through the love of Jesus, but also through the example they've heard of other Christians and other women. And that's what motivates us in what we're doing. And it's great to be able to share some of that.
This is exactly what gives me the hope for the future. We have a fantastic team in the Middle East, and beautiful young ladies that they have seen that a CEO, yes, can be a woman. And I really pray that these young girls in SAT-7, they will grow up in their positions and in their skills and in their talents, and take a rolling model position in this ministry where Jesus Christ shines first, and of course the respect of people around to be gained, because they are women leaders.
Thank you. I wonder if we can just close on thinking about what we can be what we can be praying for specifically, and also maybe just reflecting on our conversation this afternoon. If there's one thing that, those of us around the table, those of us in the audience today, and listening back on to the podcast later, if there's one thing that we can kind of take away from our conversation and that we can take forward, what that might be, and again, what we might be practically, tangibly praying for as well.
Well, I'd love to pray. When one of us was talking, I think it was Rita, about young women being seen, being known by God, being loved by God. As you mentioned at the beginning, Sophie, I work a lot with asylum seekers and refugees here in the UK, and I have a group of lovely Iranian women who have been very disillusioned by Islam, and to the point that they didn't believe in Islam anymore. And then they've seen in churches here in the UK how God loves them. The Christians around them have welcomed them and see them and hear their stories. And for many of them, it's still a very difficult, hard journey. And I would love to pray for Iranian Christian converts here in the UK, and there are many of them, because I think they could be church leaders of the future, both, and also while we're talking about them in this country, not forgetting the ones in Iran as well.
Well, yeah, I just want to say I think we can all do something different in our lives. I mean, I'm going to embarrass my mum now. My mum is here. And she had 3 daughters. And she showed us, what it was to be a woman, to bring up a family and to work. And it's an inspiration. I graduated the same day as my mum from university. And, I think one never gives up. One perseveres, and we can model that, can't we, to our friends, to our family, our friends, and just encourage young girls. They may want to go to be a nurse, and that's great. They may want to be a doctor, and that's amazing as well. And I think just use the talents that God has given you. I think that's the way to look at it. And yeah, so that would be my takeaway and encouragement to everyone here.
Maybe pray also for the young women leaders within the ministry. We gave new roles to 2 women, or 3 women in particular, 3 weeks ago, to be directors. And a couple of them are very young. So pray for these young leaders to have this confidence that God can use them like men, and not to be intimidated if they are working with other men, because it's the Middle East society. At the end, the Middle East culture is it's a man-dominated culture more than women. So please pray for these new leaders in the ministry there in Egypt, Lebanon, and Iran.
Thank you, Rita. I think something for me, it's really lovely, just before we kind of close, it's really lovely to have some very practical things that we can be thinking about, that we can be praying about. And I know I say this all the time on the podcast, but as Christians, we really believe that prayer matters, that prayer makes a difference, and that prayer is important. And so it's really lovely that we can have some kind of practical things that we can be praying for. So thank you for sharing those. I think for me personally, just the real humility, I think, that we've seen in the conversation today is something that I'm really going to take away. And it's lovely to be able to see that, as you mentioned, Rita, you can be, a strong and a really great leader, but you can also be, fully yourself, your God-made self, which is flawed, right? We're all flawed. And that is a real strength in our leadership. And if we can have the vulnerability to lead in that way, then that gives something to our organizations, to our communities, in a way that, pretending those don't exist maybe doesn't. And so personally, I'd like to thank you for all of you for sharing those really amazing reflections and thoughts. And you've all been very raw and honest. honest, and it, much to your credit, as we were just saying about leadership. And I just want to thank you all so much for being here today. It's honestly such a privilege to have this conversation, to have it with you all in person is also lovely. It's not something we get to do all that often. And as always, I feel like we could continue this conversation for days, and we could dive more into the culture in the region and things, and there are so many different things that we could explore. And I say this again all the time, but perhaps we can do a part 2 at some stage. But yeah, just want to say thank you so much for joining us all. It's been a real privilege to have you here with us today.
Thanks for joining us around the table. If you enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to hit follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, and maybe even leave a quick review. It really helps others to find the podcast. You can keep the conversation going with us on socials at SAT-7 UK or find out more at sat7uk.org. Join us next time as we share more real stories and bold ideas around the table.